The change has clearly been extraordinary. I think it's all around us. I think it's in every borough. I think what's been positive is there's lots of great new architecture. The city feels safe. I think it feels inclusive. I think it feels like a place where everyone around the world wants to come to and be in. And it feels like a place where lots of different things happen. And so it has an economic resiliency that I think is very important. Uh, on the less positive side, I think there are still certainly big issues of affordability in terms of housing. I think we still have to do much more to diversify the job base in the city. Uh, we are far behind still on the production of the infrastructure that we need. And I use that term in the broadest sense. So not just infrastructure in terms of what we traditionally think of as, subway lines and sewers and so forth, which we do need, clearly, but kind of an infrastructure of opportunity. The schools that we need, the parks that we need, the larger social service net that we need. A lot of that is being provided and is doing well, but at the same time, I think there's a number of instances you could look at where we could be doing much better. And on the hard infrastructure, we could certainly be doing much better, and our competitors are actually beating us right now. It's very funny. When I worked at the city, I'll never forget a public meeting where an elderly woman stood up, got to the microphone, and said, "Young man, you keep talking about all this change. You keep talking about how the city needs to grow up. Haven't we grown up? Aren't we grown up enough?" And I think that in recent years, it's becoming harder to propose change in New York. Um, you know, if you go down to Washington Square Park, right, and the renovations that are taking place there, it's absolutely beautiful. I think there are still four impending lawsuits associated with that park renovation. Everything we seem to do seems to be contentious, litigious, and yet people still say there's too much change, and that really shocks me and surprises me. If you look at the city historically and the amount of tumult there's been in the city, if you look at the amount of change that's taking place in East London, in Hong Kong, in Berlin, both emerging economies as well as what some people call mature economies. Cities are places where change occurs on a very, very rapid pace, and especially big global cities. And so I actually think in the last 10 years, in some ways, we've become more change averse as a society and as a city. Yeah, I think the architectural quality has clearly increased. You see both young emerging firms as well as some of our most prestigious voices in the design world practicing here now. I think it's a hotbed of a certain kind of design. And I think in terms of things like the High Line and Lincoln Center, and certainly the transformation of the waterfront, which I think is one of the great kind of unsung stories of the last decade, there have been great changes in design in the way that the city overall, not just the architectural community, but the leadership of the city and the day-to-day citizens of the community look at the design world. It's odd in some ways. Some of that I think did come from 9/11. It struck me as an extraordinary thing that you'd ride the subway and people would be reading their New York Post article about Daniel Libeskind or Norman Foster's scheme or Think's scheme, and that always amazed me that the level of dialogue about design in the city kind of had permeated to that level. Um, and whereas I think it's a positive thing that people are more design conscious. I think that one thing we still struggle with as a community is how issues of equity and social justice play into some of that design transformation. So, for instance, if you look at the new luxury condominiums that have been built all around the High Line, I think people celebrate the fact, and I certainly do, that that's a very architecturally ambitious neighborhood. And yet, most of what's been built that is the more architecturally ambitious stuff are condos for which there are no affordable housing programs in the city. Whereas the more mundane buildings that have been built actually tend to be rental buildings that tend to have affordable housing components in them. And so I think this is something that the design community still needs to kind of reconcile with, which is how to bring a better quality of design to day-to-day citizens and people with lesser means. I think the primary success, which is the hardest one to pin down because it's not really a policy, is a level of conscientiousness about the built environment, that our built environment matters and that our built environment is a sacred trust, that we're stewards over it. And so every street, every sidewalk, every bench has value and meaning. And so that I think has been critically important because, as someone who is part of the administration, it's easy to point to the things that the administration's been proactive about. And the list goes on and on and on in terms of the number of places in which the administration's actively gone out and tried to get things built and has gotten things built. But I think what is harder for people to see and understand are the number of proposals that come to the city to which the city reacts. And at that moment, how the city reacts is critically important. First and foremost, you have a mayor who doesn't owe anyone to anything. And that really shifts the conversation that you as a bureaucrat, and I mean that word in the best sense of the word, can have with a project sponsor, right? Nothing's about a favor to the mayor or anything that ever happened, that's untoward. It's always about, well, what's the best possible result here within the context of urban policy and planning? I think that's been extraordinarily powerful, and I think it's led to lots of smaller, unsung projects where the sidewalk's a little better, the lighting's a little better, the signage is a little better, where there's been a kind of ethos that says if you're going to come into city planning, you're going to come into a different agency and you're going to propose a building somewhere, and somehow it's non-conforming with the existing rules, and so therefore, it needs to be different, it needs to change, that there's an obligation on the part of the project sponsor to make it as best as it could be. And I think the administration has really pushed that, and I think it's been very palpable, the sort of day-to-day, sort of granular experience of the city, not just the big projects that we all read about and celebrate. It sounds trite, but I do think we're going to look back on it as a certain golden era of city building. Um, we, and again, I think that golden era is going to be looked at in some ways at the more granular things, right? At the new parks, at the clean playgrounds, certain new pieces of heavy infrastructure that are getting built. Um, Lots of housing production, not as much office production as probably we should have seen. The office market, I think, has certain inefficiencies, and that's worrisome because for a city like ours, those big office buildings are the equivalent of our factories, right? Employ lots of people, and other cities have been ahead of us, and other countries have been ahead of us in terms of office production. But I think people will look at it again as a golden era in terms of the conscientiousness that has been brought to the built environment, and certainly to issues of sustainability. Uh, but I still think we've got a long way to go. And because of the work I do, I travel a great deal, particularly in the emerging markets. And given our country's debt situation and this recalcitrance about change, I worry that we're not necessarily going to get where we need to go unless we've got leadership that's continually pushing us to say certain kinds of change are good, certain kinds of investments and expenditures are worthwhile. And we have to form a political constituency that's supportive of those policies to get to where we need to be. So I think, yes, we will look back on this as a great era of building and construction and public space in the city. It should be the harbinger of things to come. I think there's a central governance issue that we need to contend with as a city and as a country. We give an estimated $18 billion a year in tax revenue to the federal government and the state government that we don't see back. We have currently about a $31–32 billion transportation wish list in this city, which we could basically pay for in 2 years if we just got the money back that we put out into Washington and into Albany. We need to be more vocal, both as a design community and as a business community, about that issue, because it severely impairs our ability to be fiscally responsible in terms of the things we need to build and do. But moreover, at a larger level, I'm willing to ask the question of, why do we need state government? Is it an anachronism? 70% of the United States population now lives in a regional territory that crosses state lines. Yet there's no regional governance structure to represent those people. I would argue that at this point we've arrived at a moment where we no longer live in a representative democracy. Because of the way the Constitution was framed, actually, we have equal votes going to areas of rapidly decanting population, whereas we have regions that are growing, some regions much faster than our region, that don't have the representation they need to have the right kinds of mass transit, the right kind of infrastructure systems. And so I think there's a governance question that looms above all of this, right, that can then get us to, how do we plan for the growth we need? What's the infrastructure to support that growth? How do we get equity? Those three questions, I think there's an umbrella question about the right kind of governance, right, so that we control our own destiny. We control our own revenue streams, and we control our own regulatory systems in order to get those three questions answered properly.